is, it seems to me that it's borderline impossible for people like you and I to sit down with the majority of Americans and have hours-long, deep philosophical conversations about libertarianism. That's practically impossible to have done. If I could do anything, it's that I would want to change the default switch of the public at large. It seems like the default stance is trust government in crisis. Because, of course, the state has never lied to us for, the last couple of centuries. If I could change anything, it would be to change the default position to distrust until proven otherwise, not a default position of trust my elected representative or my Supreme Court nominee when he says, oh, but this is really important for security. So what can we do to distill, volumes of work on anarchy, libertarianism, free market economics, what have you, into just simply flipping the switch from natural trust to natural distrust?
Okay, well, let me say, first of all, this is why I think that a stateless position has a kind of equilibrium to it that a minarchist position does not. Because in minarchism, you still have a state. So you have to spend all your time reminding people why that state needs to stay limited.
Yes.
Even though they all have a vested interest in expanding it. Whereas if you had no state, and the idea of a state is foreign to you, and the idea is that everybody should interact with each other voluntarily, and then some guy comes along with a crown on his head and says, now wait a minute, you're all going to pay me 20% of your income. Well, the default position is already against that. Because wait a minute, that's not how we run our lives in any other part of society. Why should we do this? That would be so anomalous to people that again, that would naturally be distrust because this institution doesn't exist among them. So it seems to me that with minarchy, you've got to constantly educate people and educate them, remind them and remind them and remind them.
Yeah.
But anyway, so how do we get to that? I think it can't just be that we show where the state goes wrong, because then you just keep on getting, if we just had the right people in charge, then it wouldn't go wrong. So one of the things that, one simple thing I would recommend actually is a book. And not a book that I expect the whole public to read, but for us to read and internalize it and learn the arguments, because I think it'll make us more effective. And that is a book called The Problem of Political Authority. And that's a terribly boring title, but it is an outstanding book. It's by a professor at the University of Colorado at Boulder named Michael Huemer, Huemer. And in that book, he's making a radical anti-state libertarian argument. But he's doing so without invoking natural rights. He's doing so largely through a series of analogies. So, for instance, if you're out with your friends and you're out with 10 friends and 9 of them think you should pay for the meal, are you obligated to pay for the meal? But how is it suddenly magical and different? Is there some fairy dust that if there's a ballot box involved, all of a sudden this is magically different and now you are compelled to pay for the meal? Well, where's the step where that happens? Show me. So anyway, in other words, his book is just filled with examples drawn from daily life where you're appealing to people's ordinary moral intuitions. You're not expecting them immediately to say, let's privatize the military. You're appealing to their normal, the way they act and the way they think in everyday life. And you make them realize, but wait a minute, it's true that I do think this way 99% of the time, but I'm always making an exception for these people. Maybe there's something screwy there. That's the thing. You get that burrow in their brains that then just kind of sits and festers and eats away. We don't want them to eat too much away. We just want to eat strategically away in the brain at certain things. But I think he has the kind of approach that's most likely to get people over that first hump where they'll now be willing to think further. I mean, certainly I'm not going to argue agriculture subsidies.
Well, sure. Well, I had actually discussed this with Blake right before we went on, that the analogy I used is that now you might let a little white lie go here or there, but when it comes to your personal relationships, your employees at a business, your coworkers, what have you, if someone has just a marked pattern of constant falsehoods and deceptions, if not just outright destructive behavior, you would divorce yourself from that individual. You'd say, this is not good for me personally, professionally, whatever the case may be. But it's just so frustrating that it seems like in the public consciousness, if there's any entity that absolutely meets the description I just gave, it's the state or the American empire or whatever particular conversation you're having. But Boy, does anybody else get more passes? Does anybody?
Yeah, it's unbelievable. I mean, I've given an example of when you go shopping, let's say, and there's an item on the shelf that's not in mint condition, or there's a button that's slightly loose. You go up to that salesman, and I mean, I see people being complete jerks to say, poor salesmen. They're just the worst position, because they get yelled at all day long. Whereas you go through the TSA, there's a guy with a hand halfway down right here in your pants, and people are going, well, he's just here to keep me safe. So they accept from him things they would never, or their employer is the person who gives them money. The government is the person that takes their money away, and they're far angrier at their employer than they are at the government. And that's not normal. Wouldn't you think the guy taking the money you'd be angrier at?
Yeah.
Than the guy who's the one person on earth who's actually making your standard of living better is the person you're upset at. It's completely upside down. And it really, the more I think about it, the more I think it really, it's not just a libertarian talking point. The state really is a cult. It really is, because how else can you account for this kind of behavior and inculcating this kind of irrationality in people? It's a cult.
Yeah. Well,
and that's why they got to inculcate in the kids from the beginning. They got to get them in those yellow vehicles, get them down to the re-education camp, and get them saluting and get them honoring and get them understanding how a bill becomes a law before they even understand how a pencil gets made.
Sure. They
know how a bill becomes a law. And they know that they have to stand up when the state's machinery of destruction walks in. They know they have to stand up and salute. And I could just go on and on. John McCain would be a social pariah in any normal society, and he's held up as one to admire and as a life to emulate. That's a cult.
Yeah,
I think I have to pursue this theme further, because it's getting so obvious to me now.
No, you're exactly right. We've actually had that conversation on the show at least once or twice before. That it definitely. I mean, I feel like cult is an accurate word to use. I don't think that's an overstatement for no other reason at all. That again, there's little to no other facet of life that would get a free pass. I mean, I love history as well. I have a degree in history, and a lot of people, they talk about, well, back during alcohol prohibition, the feds were poisoning various chemicals so that if people were trying to create moonshine, they would poison themselves and that sort of story. How could you possibly believe anything that comes out of anybody's mouth who represents that institution if you know that happened? For all perpetuity, how could you possibly believe anything?
Yeah, no kidding. And then when you consider that the outrages have been so much greater, and in fact, it's hard to calculate a lot of these numbers about how many deaths there were in certain countries at the hands of governments or from war. I mean, you can make estimates based on what were the population figures before the war, what were the population figures after, and then you factor in births and deaths and whatever to try and figure it out. But whatever the number is for the 20th century, whether it's 100 million people who died in wars and totalitarian revolutions, who knows? But it's an astronomical figure. And Joe Sobran once said, he called himself the reluctant anarchist. He said, every bone in my body resists embracing the idea of anarchism. But he says, at the end of my life, I don't see what other position makes any sense. And he said, if the state is responsible for 100 million deaths in 1 century alone, how bad could anarchy be? Even before you think through the logic of, well, how could you have competing services to provide different things to people? Even before you've thought all that through, the presumption should be this can't be ideal. And he also said that one of the state's great victories is that the word anarchy fills people with dread, while the word state does not.
Sure.